Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. Today we're going to be talking again about one of the great leaders of our community in a sort of a biographical sketch of men. These are men who made Pensacola and made such a great difference in the course of their lifetime. And our subject today is Francis C. Brent. Now, as one drives all over the Escambia County community, you find the name Brent attached to all sorts of things, schools, roads, churches, and many times people say, well, that's all very nice, but who was he? Because unfortunately for our history, Francis Brent has been gone almost 100 years. He was a unique man. He was born in Pensacola in the year 1848. His mother was a Gonzales. His father was a naval officer in the Federal United States Navy. When the war between the states came, young Francis was still a very young man, but he followed his father in a different way. The father resigned from the Federal Navy and joined the Confederate Navy, led by Stephen R. Mallory. And young Francis Brent took an opportunity to join the Army, and he served all through almost all of the 4 years. He was wounded twice, captured once, and when he came back to Pensacola, both he and his father were, like much of the South, they were dead broke. But this young man had great ambition, and somehow he found a job working on the docks. He was a clerk, and he worked very hard, worked long hours, saved his money, and by the time we get into the early 1870s, he and a friend named Lewis Knowles had enough capital to come together, and they organized Pensacola's first real bank since the 1830s. It was called the Brent and Knowles Bank, and it was operated actually out of an old store down on South Palafox Street, but it was immediately successful because by then the lumbering era was beginning. The city needed a capital source, and people just flocked to the bank, and it was, as I say, a very successful operation almost from the beginning. Well, Brent and Knowles made money. 7 years later, Knowles split off and joined the Sullivan brothers in the creation of the First National Bank, but Brent worked on alone, and by now he was developing capital of his own beyond the bank. And so one by one he began to invest in other enterprises. He became the sole owner of the Brent Lumber Company. He became a partner in the Pensacola Lumber Company. And after just a couple of years, he invested along with others in an export company that was dealing with the gathering together of contracts for exporting lumber to Europe and other markets. About the same time, Brent began to work to the north. I'm not sure just how he did this, but he became a close friend of a man named Thomas R. Miller. Now, Miller is a story unto himself because he, among all of the great leaders who developed in the lumbering trade in the area north of our community, up in Bruton, Miller was a great success, and he was an interesting man because he was almost illiterate. He was a man who had no social graces to begin with, but somehow Brent and Miller became close friends, as did their wives. And so they became social companions as well as business authorities. And by the time we get into the 1890s, Brent had gone into business with Miller and became a partner in what became known as the Cedar Creek Mill in the Bruton area. Once again, success built on success. And by this time, Brent also was becoming a political figure in the Pensacola and Escambia County area. Not as a candidate himself, but he was sort of a kingmaker, working behind the scenes, putting a little money here, a little money there, and doing things that made for a better community. About the same time, he was one of the early members, not a charter member, but one of the early members of what became known as the Osceola Club. Now, the Osceola Club was well, we would call it today a gentleman's club. It was the place with the mahogany paneling, the big soft leather chairs, where the socially and business successful people came for their odd hours. It was an exclusively men's club. They allowed the ladies to join them only once each year for a little festivity at Christmas. But once again, this was one of Brent's ideas, and it went forward for much of his life. By the time we get into the late 1890s, Brent has become an associate of a very successful attorney here named William A. Blunt. And the two of these men saw a new future for themselves in making money in real estate. And what they began to do, in addition to some outlying properties outside the city, they began to buy up all of the blocks within what we would today call Pensacola's first economic block downtown. That was the block bounded by Halifax, Garden, Romana, and Bayland Streets. And one by one, they bought all of these pieces together, and they literally owned the whole block. And this is something we'll come to just a little bit later in the story. Now, by the time we move a little bit further into the 1890s again, Mr. Brent has been so successful that he put together a conglomerate, and they bought out the Sullivan brothers, so that now Mr. Brent, along with his associates, became the major stockholders in the First National Bank, which of course remained for a number of years the major bank downtown, with its headquarters at 307 South Halifax. Well, things were moving very well for Brent, and by the time we reached the year 1904, Brent and his shareholders in the First National Bank reached a point where they realized that the house, the building that they had for their operation, was too small, and so in the early part of 1905, there are wonderful stories in the Pensacola press that show what they were going to do. They felt that they needed a new operation, new site, so they purchased property just north of what was then the Federal Building on South Halifax Street, and I think the basic address was 215 South Halifax. And they had architects draw plans for a 9-story office building. And it was because, of course, the city was growing, it needed more office space, and this is well before the building of the 11-story tower, which would have been just across the street. The plans were made, and they were ready to proceed with their 9-story tower. And then on Halloween night in that very year, 1905, the Osceola Club in the Brent building in the Brent block caught fire. It was a terrible fire. It lasted all through the night, and literally it burned down to the ground every building in that entire block except the one on the corner of Romana and Halifax Street. That building did survive, and it still survives today. By the way, the Dollar Hyde Music Company has its headquarters in that building. Well, when that happened, of course, the Brent people, the First National Bank people, with Brent as its chairman, as their chairman, said, "Well, we don't need the 9-story office building anymore, so we'll fall back and regroup." And so they sent people around into the southeast here to say, what are banks doing, and what kind of new buildings are they putting in place now? And they came back with a totally different idea, which was to put in place what they called a Neo-Grecian style bank building. And that is what was built then at the corner, not on the corner, but just up from the federal courthouse. And it was occupied early in 1906. Well, things went along fairly well from that point forward. The Brent block itself was rebuilt. Mr. Blunt, who was still part owner of it, rebuilt on the corner, and what had been his 3-story building now became a 7-story structure. Mr. Brent's building, a major building, which ran along Halifax Street, what had been originally a 2-story building, it was now replaced with a 3-story building. And of course, those two structures took care of all the office needs that there would be then for several years. Well, things went forward well for Mr. Brent for the next few years. At one point, he decided he would retire from the bank building. He had done his work. He wanted to concentrate on his real estate holdings and his lumber mills. But then in 1912, he went back because there were needs at that time for the bank to expand further. And things were going along well for him. But then in the latter part of 1913, something unusual happened. This was a time, of course, when the United States went through a sort of I guess we would call it today, a recession. Some people say it came about because President Wilson forced the enactment of an income tax for the first time, and this caused business people to retreat from some of their capital work. But nonetheless, the recession caused the failure of a small new bank that had been created here recently. That bank had been called the Bank of Pensacola, which operated from part of the structure in Mr. Blunt's tower on the corner of Halifax and Garden. That was a bad sign for the downtown area, because a lot of merchants lost a great deal of money because there was no deposit insurance in those days, and consequently up and down Halifax and Garden there was a wave of concern. About 2 months later, almost to the day, Mr. Brent was sitting in his office and was handed a cablegram. which announced that the firm of Crowe Rudolph and Company, a Liverpool, Great Britain or England, English firm, had failed. Now, Crowe Rudolph was the conduit, the financial conduit for the lumber sales, which were going from the Pensacola area into Great Britain. And much of that paper transaction, the financial transaction, passed through the First National Bank, of course, which was Mr. Brent's bank. Well, this meant, as Brent quickly recognized, this meant that Crowe Rudolph owed the First National Bank almost $500,000, a huge sum for that day. And Brent, of course, there was an immediate concern, but he knew that he had over $400,000 in gold sitting in the bank, so he really wasn't concerned. But nonetheless, this was a national bank, and they were required to call in the federal regulators. And this gentleman from Washington arrived. His name was Goodhart, and as our story will tell you, that was a gentleman who was somewhat misnamed. Anyway, Mr. Goodhart came forward, examined the bank, and even though that gold situation was there, which would seem to have been more than ample for survival of the bank, Mr. Goodhart said that that bank must close, and it was forced to do so. Well, this meant, of course, another huge wave of losses for the downtown merchants, and the closing of the bank was literally, it was a disaster. Now, Mr. Brent immediately took action. He began selling off all of the other properties that he held, the export business, the various lumber bills that he had an interest in. He sold those off and began using that cash to make at least partial payment to his customers from the bank who had lost so much. And of course, he was looked upon as basically a hero, and certainly that was the case. I know of no other case in American history where that sort of thing, with that level of generosity, took place. Well, this went on for about 2 months, the payment, the selling off of properties. And one day, Mr. Brent, this is in early April, he went home and told his wife, he was coming home for lunch, told his wife, "I just don't feel too well today." He said, "I think I'm going to lie down and have a little rest before we have lunch." Well, he lay down and he never got up again. He died of a heart attack as he lay in bed. Of course, he was only 56 years old and was a terrible loss to the community. Well, 3 days later, the funeral was held. The service was held in St. Michael's Catholic Church. And thereafter, the funeral itself was conducted in St. Michael's Cemetery, where the priest, speaking on a day which was unusual for April, was cold and rainy, and he had an opportunity to talk to a large audience, and he went on and on. And by the time the service was over, the pallbearers, the 6 men, all of whom, of course, were community leaders, said to one another, "Let's go back to the new San Carlos Hotel, sit down and kind of dry out and have a cup of coffee." And they did. And as they sat there and went through the exercise of talking about what had happened, they were, well, I guess we would say they were sort of maudlin. They began to recognize that the great lumber resource that had been here for forever was now almost gone. We had had 2 bank losses within a matter of days, and this was affecting the merchants adversely. And of course, one of them recalled that, "Look, I've been reading the newspaper, and we could be at war, or they could be at war in Europe almost any day now, and what would that do to Pensacola's overseas lumber trade?" Well, they were all concerned. And I close the story on Mr. Brent this way. His death and the adventures and the various events that were taking place at that time brought Pensacola into a very unusual situation. We became, at this point in time, with the failure of the banks, we became a capital-starved community. And that meant, of course, that people just did not have the money for big new ventures, and we then went from the time of his death, Mr. Brent's death, for almost 50 years without building a new building of greater than 2 stories in all of downtown. Francis Brent, a remarkable citizen, did so much for Pensacola over more than half a century. He was surely one of our great community leaders.